Yep.
Great. So thank you to our three panelists today, Dr. Jackie Cheney, Dr. Liam McDermott, and Dr. Erin Scanlon, who all do research related to disability and physics. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Well, hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's so nice to have you all here. My name is Erin Scanlon. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an assistant professor in residence at the University of Connecticut. And today, Jackie, Liam, and I are going to talk about some of our research about disability in physics, talking about things like mentors' experiences, looking at framing things about neurodiversity, as well as then hearing from student experiences about what it's like to be disabled in physics. Before we get into that, I would love to have Jackie and Liam introduce yourselves. Jackie, you want to go first?
Sure. I am Jackie Cheney. I am an associate professor in the physics department in my first year at The Ohio State University. I just recently moved here from University of Central Florida. Liam?
Howdy, I'm Liam. I use he, they pronouns, and I am actually Aaron's postdoc over at UConn Avery Point, and I mainly look at this disability through the lens of neurodiversity.
Awesome. Well, I have been tasked with giving us a little bit of framing and background information about disability to get us all on the same page of what we're going to be discussing. And then we're going to go through and have each of us present a short little snippet of our research. And then we'll hopefully have about 30-ish minutes at the end for some time for questions. If you have questions throughout, please feel free to put them in the chat. We would be happy to answer them as we go, or you can wait until the end. With that, let's dive in. So I'd like to start by talking about two different models of disability. If you look at the left-hand picture, you'll notice that we have a person wearing a t-shirt that says the problem on it, and we have a bunch of arrows pointing towards the person that are also labeled the problem. So in the individual, or what's sometimes known as the medical model of disability, we view disability as something that is wrong with the person or that needs to be remediated. The burden of that remediation is placed on the individual. So it's the individual who needs to change or deal with a lack of access. On the other side, you'll notice I have another picture. This is labeled the society, or what's called the social model of disability. In this case, the person is no longer wearing a shirt that says the problem, and now those arrows are labeled as barriers pointing away from the person. So in the social model of disability, disability is really about the interaction between a person's ability and the environment. So we can think of ways in which the environment creates barriers to access and participation for people. And so the burden of change is within the environment. So it's not the individual that needs to change, it's the environment. We find this to be a pretty helpful framing when we're talking about disability because it is focusing on what we as instructors can do in our classroom to better support the wide range of people who want to join our community. So we're going to be framing our work using the social model of disability. Another thing I wanted to mention about disability is specific disability language. And I wanted just to mention that it's pretty contested. If you look at different groups of people, they prefer different kinds of language. Two common forms of disability specific language are person first. So that would be like person with a disability or person with autism, for example. On the other hand, we have impairment first or identity first language, and that's something like a disabled person or an autistic person. There are trends amongst communities. For example, many in the autistic community prefer to be called an autistic person rather than a person with autism, as it centers the salience of that identity to their lives. Throughout the talk today, we're going to use different kinds of language to represent the fact that it is contested across communities. So let's look at a little bit about representation of disabled people in the higher education context. So if we look at the world, disabled people represent about 15% of the world's population. And I want to note that this statistic is from 2015. So obviously some pretty significant events have happened since then. So we would expect this representation to have changed as well. Disabled people comprise approximately 10 to 20% of the post-secondary student population. And two notes on that, you'll notice that there's a range because those were measured using different definitions of disability, as well as these are only the students who register for accommodations through your Office of Disability Services at their campuses. We know that many students don't disclose their disability identity, and so we expect that the number of students with disabilities in post-secondary is significantly higher. Disabled people, if we look at science and engineering, they enroll in those majors at similar rates to those without disabilities. And if we look at the workforce context, they comprise about 9% of employed physical scientists, about 3% of employed life, physical, and social scientists, and about 10% of the federal civilian non-postal employees. So we can see that people with disabilities are everywhere, right? We're people just like others. And so we exist in these spaces and should be planned for within the community. Additionally, the representation of different disability diagnoses have also changed over time. So if you look at the y-axis of this graph, this is showing the change in percent from 2000, and the x-axis is showing time from 2000 to 2015. That's the most currently available national level data, but we are hoping that in the next couple of years, we'll have some more data. If you notice, we have other and cognitive impairments have a significant change in percentage since 2000. Other includes things like speech impairments, traumatic brain injury, and a couple other diagnoses. On the other end of the spectrum, you'll notice that physical and mobility disabilities have been decreasing over time. Now, that doesn't mean there are less people with physical and mobility disabilities. It's just that their representation in the group of people with disabilities is getting lower. So my point in showing you these data is to make that because our student population is changing, their needs are likely going to be changing, and thus our instructional strategies should also change to meet the needs of the students in our classes. And so we can expect to provide a wide range of supports for the wide range of students who enroll in our courses. Looking at some legal frameworks related to disability, at the K-12 setting, we have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or what's usually called IDEA. That mandates that K-12 institutions not only provide accommodations and support for students with disabilities, but we also have to identify and provide diagnosing for those students. At the post-secondary level, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act as well as the Rehab Act, and those focus more on providing accommodations, and we no longer are required to identify and diagnose students. So students have to request accommodations and go through sometimes a lengthy process in order to receive them. Overall, if we look at the legal frameworks in general, they say that equitable access to education is mandated for disabled students, as well as the fact that discrimination based on disability is prohibited in specifically the post-secondary setting. So we have people with disabilities in the physics communities. We have laws that are designed to support them. However, if we look at some of the literature, we see that post-secondary faculty often lack awareness about and training to support disabled students. Jackie and I, as well as a couple of colleagues, did a study looking at STEM curricular materials and noticed that they weren't designed to support disabled students from the beginning, nor do they provide support for instructors on how to modify the materials to support the wide range of learners. We also can look at the attitudes and beliefs, which can give us a proxy measure of something about the culture. And we see that STEM professionals hold negative attitudes and beliefs about disability in general. So you might be thinking to yourself, why would that be, right? If we have people with disabilities and we have these legal frameworks, why do we have disparities in preparation for people who are going to support them? Well, it comes down to ableism, right? So let's go through and define that term real quick. And then I'll give you some examples of what ableism looks like in post-secondary STEM. So ableism is described as discrimination or prejudice in favor of able-bodied people. And able-bodied people are people who have typical or normal abilities defined based on the culture in which you are situated. There are some ableist beliefs, and I would like to note that before I show you these ableist beliefs, we know that these are wrong, but some ableist beliefs are that able-bodied people are inherently superior to disabled people, that able-bodied people possess the essential qualities to participate in normal society, and that they should be designed for physically, culturally, and systemically within our classrooms or within our professional spaces. Everything we do in society is political, and everything is embedded and steeped within society. We know that physics is steeped in these traditions as well. So because the culture in the United States is such that we have ableism endemic in it, that means that we are also ableist by default unless we are working towards being anti-ableist. So it takes intentional work to undo the ableism that is in our courses from the start. So let's give a couple examples of what ableism looks like. One of them is this tweet that I found by Natalie Gordon. In the picture, it shows a bunch of oranges or citrus fruit that have been peeled and placed into plastic containers. The quote that goes along with it is, "If only nature would find a way to cover these oranges so we didn't need to waste so much plastic on them." Very pithy remark. However, it pits environmentalism against the needs of the individual. So some people don't have the dexterity or the mobility or the limbs in order to peel an orange. And so they would need to rely on a companion to help them do that. In order to promote independence, we can provide peeled oranges for people so that they can engage with them. I'm not going to argue about which is more important, environmentalism or ableism. They are both important things for us to consider, and we have to wrestle with that as a society. Another example of ableism, this is a picture that I took at a coffee shop in Florida. This is an accessible restroom. If on the left-hand side, you'll notice there's a toilet, and then on the right-hand side where there's supposed to be empty space, there's now a stack of chairs. So the people in this establishment were prioritizing the needs of people who are going to use the restroom in a normal way, that they don't need a companion, or they don't require a mobility aid, or they don't need additional space in order to navigate the toilet. So again, they're prioritizing and centering the needs of able-bodied people while decentering or marginalizing people who have disabilities. So those are some examples of ableism kind of in general. Let's look at some in the post-secondary STEM context in particular. So one example is not using microphones at academic conferences. Not everybody has the same hearing ability. And so when you are using your teacher voice or not utilizing a microphone, you're making it so that not everybody can engage with what you're saying. Many conference venues also have the ability to connect the microphone sound to a captioner or a real-time transcriber who can provide additional access to the information. So by not using the microphones, again, you're centering people who have hearing and decentering people who don't. Another one is believing that students with ADHD or learning disabilities or dyslexia are lazy and not trying hard enough. I had a colleague who mentioned that he noticed one of his students had a really messy backpack and he was really upset about that. Not everybody does all of these things the same way. And so that means that can you all still hear me, by the way? Now you. I'm sorry, my headphones died. I'm sorry. Okay, so this is a fallacy, right? Just because somebody does physics in a different way or thinks about physics in a different way doesn't mean that they're lazy or wrong or bad or not trying hard enough. We can also look at things like physical accessibility and look at the shapes of desks in classrooms that only allow for certain shapes or sizes or different mobilities and dexterities of bodies. Again, that's only planning for one type of body, and that's an example of ableism. The last example I'll give you is not having to all levels of a large research experiment. So if we have a large experiment that spans multiple levels, not everybody can walk the stairs in order to reach different levels. So we want to make sure that we're providing access in that way as well. So that is some examples and some context for you about disability. For now, we are going to transition over to having the three of us present short presentations about some of our work that we're doing. We're going to have Liam talking about his critical disability physics framework. Then I'm going to talk about what disabled students wish instructors knew about them. And then finally, Jackie's going to talk about physics mentors' conceptions of disability and physics. So from here, I'm going to turn it over to Liam to take it away.
Heck yeah. I assume that I'll just be able to be like, next slide. Cool. So yeah, I very recently graduated from Rutgers. My thesis was looking at how neurodivergent students and faculty look at themselves as well as like themselves in relationship to their environment as neurodivergent people. And so really what was fascinating is all the different ways in which neurodiversity and being a physicist sort of interplayed. Both a lot of people thought that like they were neurodivergent people first, a lot of people thought that they were physicists first, and a lot of people thought that they were both. And so I really wanted to look at how that identity comes to be. And so I want to talk a little bit about my dissertation, developing and operationalizing a critical disability physics identity framework. Next slide. So in order to discuss that, we first got to talk about the model. And so I developed a critical disability physics identity model out of two major identity models, both in physics and in disability studies. And so I looked at both Simone Hyder-Adams's critical physics identity and Michelle Putnam's political disability identity, sort of taking that politicalness of disability and that politicalness of physics and smashing them together. And so, as you can see here, there's physics constructs, disability constructs, and resources. Physics constructs interact with resources, they become resources themselves to strengthen someone's disability identity, and vice versa. Disability constructs through resources and by becoming resources strengthen physics constructs, physics identity. And so some things that popped out of this is that having a strong sense of self can really improve the resistant capital that people need to resist inequality. What I mean by that is a lot of the people that I interviewed, they talked about how when they started to figure out that they were neurodivergent and figure out that they specifically like do physics differently or navigate the world differently, it allowed them to start resisting like just the little acts of ableism every day in classes, whether it be the time that homework takes or the shortened test periods or anything like that, right? However, like a person's identity is not just like one thing. It's not just physicist. I am myself a white assigned male at birth physicist, right? I'm autistic. I have ADHD. I contain multitudes, right? And so instead of just physicists, right, people can identify as early career physicists or late career physicists or Black physicists or disabled physicists. All these things add extra dimensions to one's identity. And so, as I said, experiences as a disabled person strengthen and affect people's experiences as physicists and vice versa. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper into that in the next slide. How do we break up this identity? So we have physics constructs. That's a person's interest, a person's recognition and belonging, and a person's performance and how it aligns with their competence. So in this study, I really wanted to first and foremost approach with the philosophy that every single person I interviewed is competent. They know how to do physics. They are physicists, and it's very hard to be a physicist without being competent at physics in some way. And in that, I take the implicit understanding that being competent in physics might not look the same for everybody. And so a person's interest being, are they just generally interested in physics? A person's recognition and belonging is someone seeing themselves in the community and recognized by their peers and those in the hierarchy above them. And again, performance aligned with competence. Are people performing the same way that they are competent or not? These interact with resources. That comes from Simone Hyder-Adams's work, where you have ideational, the things you think, the relational, the people you know, and the material resources, the stuff you have, and the stuff you have access to. And then finally, there's disability constructs from Michelle Putnam's political disability identity, but I shifted them a little bit to self-worth. Do you feel that you have equal or positive value in society to non-disabled people? Do you understand that even though that you have that equal worth, that you are discriminated against in whether little or big ableist ways? Do you have a sense of pride and community in the disability community, in being disabled? Do you see other people and go, oh, what's good for you is good for me in terms of achieving this anti-ableist goal? And then do you take, or do other people take political acts to achieve that anti-ableist goal? So this is a lot of stuff, right? But when you smush those all together, you get a pretty comprehensive full dimension of someone being a disabled physicist. So how does that apply to neurodiversity? We will see on the next slide. So quick breather. We've talked about the model. Let's talk a little bit about the model of neurodiversity. What do I even mean by I looked at neurodivergent students? In short, it's a celebration of people's brains, people's minds, that everybody's brain mind works differently, and that those differences, some may be subtle, some may be not, but they're all equally valid simply by virtue of people exist. That by virtue that people are around and their brains are cool, you know? And so we take the assumption that society privileges people whose brains work at a specific normative way. This looks like people solving problems in linear A to B fashion, how people interact, right? I am autistic. I don't like to make eye contact. That is a general social faux pas. And how they respond to their environment. Similarly, I'm autistic. I can't wear certain shirts because they are gross and bad and they feel awful because I have a sensory disorder. And so by applying this neurodiversity framework to disability, we can look at people who are neurodivergent, people who are autistic, ADHD, OCD, dyslexic, dyspraxic, et cetera, and celebrate those differences in order to change societal norms and encourage and support people whose brains work differently. But you can't do that if you don't know who you're dealing with, right? You can't, I can't just be like, yay, we've made the world better for neurodivergent people without actually talking to neurodivergent people about their experiences in physics. And so on the next slide, we will see sort of first what like neurodivergent is, and I've described sort of a few, but it's an umbrella, right? It is there are not just it's not just autistic people, it's not just ADHD folks, it's a lot of people, and in fact I include people who don't otherwise identify as neurodivergent in as being affected positively by a neurodivergent umbrella, because everybody's brains work differently in subtle ways. That doesn't mean that when I teach a class, I'm going to teach it perfect for 30 neurotypical people, even if they're all neurotypical, right? Some people have different preferences. Some people have different time in the day, right? And so it's really useful to view neurodivergent and neurodiversity in general as this umbrella term, both out of an umbrella term just being a thing to collect groups of people, but also an umbrella term because an umbrella does shield you from the rain, right? It helps to, if in collection, shield people from ableist and generally bad ways that people are treated simply because their brains are different. Next slide. So what on earth, now that we have neurodiversity as a concept and we have CDPI, the critical disability physics identity as a concept, what does that look like when you smash them together? Oh, hold on. I think my speaker, can you still hear me? Neat, cool. So some things that popped out of this study. One, there's a distinct disconnect between the concept of physicist. One of my questions was just like, what makes you tick as a physicist? What is a physicist to you? And there's a very strong cognitive disconnect between cognitive dissonance between physicist as a title that is earned and physicist as an identity that is claimed. And that causes a significant, like, again, cognitive dissonance of a lot of the participants that I interviewed, because they're like, yeah, no, I'm a physicist. And that keeps me going, but like, I'm not respected as a physicist, right? So it's not like I know things. And so when other people started performing better in terms of like performing more normatively, it sort of reinforces this idea that like I'm not going to get the title. I am simply an identity, and that's nebulous in the air that means nothing. When it does mean a lot, right? Uh, we also see that by performing physics differently, right? Otherwise saying non-normatively, neurodivergent physicists had created a community in which they were constantly being perceived as bad physicists. Um, and that really lowers someone's sense of belonging in physics. They're not going to really want to stay in physics if they don't feel like they're doing it okay, if they're good at their job, right? We also see a belief in a somewhat like unfeeling higher level university admin, and specifically that they have full control over success and access. That there's some ODS, some Office of Disability Services, or even like some just professor who is the sole arbiter of can I get into grad school? Can I get into the positions that I want? Can I get a job? Right? And that's not very conducive for like just generally self-efficacy, right? Um, we also see that people feel that this success in physics is just not merit-based. It's based on the moon and the tides, and not knowing things about the moon and the tides, just simply how they work. And then also again, there's this negative peer-peer comparison that someone is doing physics better and therefore they're worse, or the neurodivergent person is worse, or there's also a couple of people who are like, I'm seen as the smartest person in class, but I get stuck so often and I don't get access to help. I am in fact too abled that when my disability does show, I can't get access. And that's not a good thing. That creates a very, very strong sense of, again, non-inclusion, and really is a detriment to someone's performance if they can't learn how to perform in the way that gives them a good grade, you know? So next slide. So that's all well and good, right? That's sort of what people said and how they form their identity. And as you can see, there's a lot of bad things, right? A lot of negative sense of being a physicist, negative sense of belonging, negative sense of recognition by their peers. But that's not to say that it was only negative, right? A lot of people that I interviewed were also like, no, being neurodivergent makes me amazing at doing physics in a research sense, or amazing at communicating with my peers in ways that I can teach better, right? Because a lot of people that I interviewed were like, no, I teach better simply because I don't think in this linear A to B fashion. I'm not going, I need to find the acceleration of a ball down a hill. I'm not going, well, it's just this. You just show it. Uh, there's a multitude of ways to solve a problem. And so something else that came out of this study that's much more pertinent to optics and much more pertinent to folks who want to teach neurodivergent students is simply, what do they want you to know? And so we conducted a little mini study, and we found four main themes popped out of that. One, that professors need to both understand and accept that they are ill-equipped to teach neurodivergent students. Now, that sounds very mean. And a lot of the people that I interviewed, they're like, I get that this is going to sound like one of the meanest things that I can say to a teacher, that they are ill-equipped to teach me. But they're like, no, I want to be able to share my ability to teach me, right? And so a way around this is really to swallow some pride and have this open door policy about access needs. I know exactly, Chris, that like I as a white man am very ill-equipped to teach like any non-white student because I just don't have the sense of being non-white, right? Uh, exactly. Uh, Another thing that people wanted you to know is that coming out as neurodivergent is really often a last-ditch effort to succeed in class. A lot of times neurodivergent students, especially if they don't have access through ODS or other forms of Office of Disability Services, uh, a lot of times they feel a sense of shame or that they're sharing something that is just very personal to them, that they are struggling, right? That they are not performing normatively. Uh, and so it's very important to take the assumption, first and foremost, that all your students potentially could be disabled, right? They could be neurodivergent and they could be needing some form of, for instance, universal design. I wonder if that might pop up. But another thing that people wanted you to know is that being neurodivergent is a fundamental aspect of being oneself. There's no way to simply turn off being neurodivergent. There's no amount of hard work that can make you not neurodivergent, right? Uh, and going back to the previous slide, that um, being neurodivergent, right, is not a lazy thing, right? It's a trying real hard thing in a society that doesn't privilege ways of thinking that are neurodivergent, right? And so the way around that, just meet students where they're at. Don't require that they meet neurotypical normative expectations. What does that look like? Doing oral exams or having an option for an oral exam, or like having options for like later homeworks, or like soft deadlines, but with the understanding that homework can be extended to X date, right? Um, and then also, very, very critically, not everybody knows that they're neurodivergent. This sort of took two different ways, so, like two different concepts. Um, and so really people either looked at it as one, I got a lot of response of my professors are neurodivergent, and I just wish that they knew it, because it would make our communication far better. Or they're like, hey, I didn't know I was neurodivergent until junior year of college, and that didn't help me freshman year, you know? Um, and so yes, to answer your question, Joe, neurodivergence absolutely can begin in high school and go unnamed or unrecognized, and brushed off as just their personality. It can even be from birth. It can be any number of things. And a lot of times, like it goes unnamed, right? To give an example from my life, I got tested when I was in seventh grade, and then got my like medical records essentially hidden from me until I turned 18, in the guise of like, oh, if we don't tell him, it's fine. He won't know and won't use it as a crutch. That didn't work, but like it was unnamed until I was like 18, and then I suddenly was like, oh my God, this is a thing. um, and so sometimes there just aren't tools for finding out good strategies. And so if we take the understanding that everyone could be disabled, everyone could be neurodivergent, that's amazing. And that's going to help even the neurodivergent students who don't know that they're neurodivergent. I think that's my last slide. So I will turn it over to Erin. Oh, actually, before I turn that over to Erin, can I answer that question? Cool. Okay, I got you. More papers, community building at conferences. Oh yes, so I uh, I would suggest one, reading papers, two, talking to students. Just generally having this open, honest communication between students and faculty, and just generally instructors. But yeah, reading more papers, talking at an individual level, and more broadly, creating these accessible spaces for neurodivergent people to share. Also, I realized that I'm talking to you as if you were neurotypical. My apologies. Yes, I would suggest for specifically a neurodivergent person, going to conferences, being loud and out, and being like, "Hey, students, hey, faculty, I am neurodivergent. This is what that means for you, and this is what that means for me." Does that make sense?
Yes, and Liam, you want to share a little bit about your work that you're going
Oh,
to be
yes.
working on now?
Yeah, so something that popped out is this of my dissertation is this idea that every single person talked about that they do physics differently. They solve problems just differently than neurotypical peers. And whether that looked like one person said that they experienced quote unquote firework thought, where they're like, hey, I have this one idea and then explodes into three more ideas, and that idea explodes into three more ideas, and so you end up with like 9 paths to take in this linear A to B problem. Or there's another person who's like, I just can't see in pictures, right? I can't think in pictures, or I only think in pictures, right? This is a concept called aphantasia, or hypophantasia, I think is the opposite of that. But so what we want to look at is like how do those manifest, how like those differences in solving problems manifest in physics performance, specifically at the undergrad level. So looking at people who have taken introductory physics courses and having them solve introductory physics problems, and then looking at the ways that they solve that, and sort of delving deeper into their experiences as neurodivergent people who do physics differently. That's the research in a nutshell.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Liam. So I'm going to pick up on that strand of like, what do disabled students wish that instructors knew about them, and talk a little bit about the student perspective. So this is part of a larger project called the Courses to Careers project, addressing ableism in physics through faculty-student partnerships. So our goal for this project is to create professional development opportunities that's kind of dual-stranded. So we create one side that's focused on physics instructors and helping them build up inclusive teaching strategies and accessible practices for their classroom. And then we also are creating a professional development side for disabled physics students to learn about what are the physics careers, how can we get prepared for the physics profession, and to do some career exploration. So they are both groups, the instructors and the students, are givers of knowledge and receivers of knowledge in that case, so they can be mutually beneficial partnerships. As part of developing these professional development opportunities, we convened a design team to help us create the professional development. I just want to show the team members who are involved in this project. We have Daryl McPadden, Matt Guthrie, Xian Wu, myself, our grad student Theo Botts, and we have Tanya Adams, who is a rehabilitation counselor for the state of Michigan. So this is the PI team. And then the actual design team met for 5 weeks during the summer, and included 6 students. I'm going to show them up here. I can't even describe to you how amazing these design team meetings were and the kinds of experiences that they were sharing with us about what it's like to have a disability in physics. Specifically, we asked participants to speak about their responses synchronously during these design team meetings, as well as we created an asynchronous notes document. So we have their written word as well as their spoken word to read from and to analyze their responses. Over the course of these 5 weeks, we focus primarily on what students wish instructors knew about them and about their disability in order to help prepare them more. I'm going to share out some of our findings from this. That's going to be published in a forthcoming TPT paper. So the first question that we wanted to present was about what are some common misbeliefs about students with disabilities. So a lot of them came around this idea that they feel their instructors think that they're lazy, or that they're bored, or that they're not engaged. That might be because of missing homework assignments, or that may be because of getting distracted during class. But all of the students in our design team talked about the fact that they were trying really hard to be successful, and their instructors just didn't recognize that effort that they were putting into the course. Another common misbelief is that you seem fine or you're doing well, right? If you don't see that a student is struggling, or you don't notice when they're having an episode or a flare-up of their chronic health condition, then they might seem fine to you. But we have to know that students, like Liam said, contain multitudes, right? And they might have something going on outside of class that maybe make them not fine. So we can't just assume that everybody's doing okay just based on our own able-bodied perspective. Students with disabilities are just lazy or not working hard. So again, that's another kind of piece there, that they felt like their instructors didn't recognize when they were putting in effort into the course. They might not maybe wouldn't complete all of the homework problems, and the instructors would think that they were just not engaged in the course or not really committed to engaging, even though the students were very committed to the courses and wanted to be successful. Another one is you don't look like you have a disability. So not all disabilities are apparent. We can't see all of them. Some of them happen inside of our body or inside of our minds. So just because a person doesn't look like they have a disability doesn't mean that they do. Like Liam said, we can just assume that all of our students have a wide range of needs, abilities, and interests and design for that from the beginning. And the last misconception I'd like to share is about accommodations. So as a reminder, accommodations are the supports that are provided for students who register with our Office of Disability Services. Those accommodations can be things like extended time on tests, it could be note-taking assistance, all the way to things like housing accommodations in the dormitories. So one common misconception about students with disabilities and about accommodations is that these accommodations are handouts, or they're unfair, or they're asking for something that's not due to them. We have to remember that we are steeped in ableism in our society. And so when we design our courses without thinking about ableism or without thinking about disabled students from the start, we're likely to overlook them and miss them in our planning. And so we have to design and be intentional about our design to include the wide range of people who want to participate. Oops, I had another one, sorry. Another misconception is about accommodations is some instructors will say like, oh, my class is fine, my class is easy, you're not gonna need your accommodations, and then they don't provide the accommodations for students. Not only are they federally mandated into law that we provide them, but again, they are leveling the playing field. They're undoing and reacting to the ableism that's present in our courses from the start. The next question is thinking about like, instead of approaching with these misbeliefs, what do you wish instructors knew instead about you and about your experiences in the classroom? And so our design team members said things like, everyone's experiences are different. We want to support students on an individual basis. Not everybody's the same. We all contain multitudes. We all have different facets, different experiences, different identities, different likes and dislikes. And we want to make sure that we're not pigeonholing students with disabilities into a box only based on their disability identity. The other thing I'm going to mention is disability isn't a monolith. So one person with ADHD's experience might be different than a second person's experience with ADHD. We want to make sure that we are working with the individual. Another thing is that your expectations within the course, meaning like what you are expecting students to learn or the rigor of the course, shouldn't change, but the path or approach to learning the material or gaining the skills might look different. So we as instructors shouldn't be changing the academic rigor of the courses. That's not what our design team members said they were looking for, and said they were looking for support on how to reach those objectives. Many of our design team members also mentioned the fact that their disability isn't stagnant, right? It's not going to be the same from one day to the next day. They might, have a flare up of a chronic health condition, or it might change over time as they age and they learn more about themselves and their own experiences. So we want to make sure that we are providing the accommodations, but not forcing students to use them if they feel like they don't need them. And then every student has a life outside of the classroom, and it's okay to have a life outside of the classroom. In fact, it's pretty healthy to do that. And so it's okay for students with disabilities also to have a life outside of the classroom. It's inappropriate for us to require them to be working 100% of the time in order to be successful in a class. Additionally, everyone has strengths. Even people with disabilities, right? Like that's a weird way to say it, but we know that everybody has strong suits. We have something to bring to the table. It might look different from person to person. For example, one of our design team members talked about how theirs wasn't about exams, but they know that they have the research chops. They've got the skills to do the research once they're in there. So not everybody looks the same. Not everybody does the same kinds of things. And we need to design for that variation from the start. The other thing I wanted to mention is that there are positive aspects of disability. right? Disability isn't always a negative thing. One of our design team members said that their hyper-focus because of their disability diagnosis makes them a better physicist because they are able to focus and look at the fine details. So there is a lot of research recently about specifically neurodiversity and looking at the positive impacts of different ways of thinking about the world. So those are some of the things that the design team members wanted instructors to know about them. Oops. And then the other thing was we wanted to talk about what can instructors do to be more approachable. A common theme across the design team was they were talking about the fact that they needed to have that relationship with their instructor. And it doesn't need to be a verbal relationship. It can be a relationship via email or in person or in class. But the students really wanted their instructors to be approachable to talk about their access needs. So you want to do things like invite conversation at the beginning of the semester. So for me, when I'm talking about my syllabus and I talk about my disability statement in there, I make it clear that I'm available to have conversation about these things, that it is my job to help students be successful. And if there are ways that I can help support them, I'm open, I'm all ears. I would love to hear about that. So we can invite those conversations. We can introduce ourselves to instructors, and being more personal makes students seeking help feel less daunting, right? So if we show our whole selves, show us as a holistic person, that can make students feel more comfortable for them to showcase their identity. We can also keep the conversation casual. It doesn't need to be a big deal. We're all humans. We can treat each other like the humans that we are, and have those conversations. I know that when I first started teaching and I had those accommodation conversations, I felt really stressed because I didn't know what I was doing. And I wanted to make sure that I was communicating, that I was open to supporting students. And that's okay to feel that way, but we also can just have the conversation, right? We can adjust our courses to be accessible and inclusive and have that conversation be a normal part of the course. We can also do things about like being verbal about flexibility and accommodations that you provide. If students don't know about what resources you're going to provide to them, then they can't utilize them. So make sure that you are sharing, that you are flexible, and that you're willing to provide accommodations multiple times throughout the semester. And the student is the expert, right? Students know about their minds, their lives, their experiences. They know what works best for them. And so the students should be the expert in their own learning. And we as instructors can learn from them about how they are going to be successful. So approach it from the standpoint that the student is the expert in their own experiences, and we are there to learn about it so that we can provide that support for them. And then we can work on meeting our students halfway to reach accommodations. So providing accommodations can sometimes be daunting, but the students are also willing to help and make sure that we're providing the accommodations to them. Then what does supporting disabled students on an individual basis look like? So instead of providing accommodations or providing inclusive teaching strategies, what can we do one-on-one to support students? Well, we can do things like checking in with them after high stakes assessments like quizzes and exams to see, how did it go for you? Did this work? Did this not work? How can we support you? Or you could do things like setting up weekly or bi-weekly short meetings to check in with people and make sure that they feel like they understand the course material. You could provide extra materials like lecture notes or videos or websites or PowerPoints to help students and support their learning style. And we can continue challenging the students in ways that encourage problem solving and deeper understanding of the course content. I like real world problems. That's what really got me excited about physics. And so having challenging problems where I can go through and show and practice my problem solving skills is really motivating for me. So find what motivates your students and encourage them to deepen their understanding in new and interesting ways. Finally, we can also be malleable with due dates so that students can manage the course content more easily, and then make sure that they have time if they need, for example, if they have a flare-up of their chronic health condition or they have to miss class for some reason, we can provide them with that flexibility on the due dates. The last things I would like to say is about how instructors and students can be held accountable if they are discriminatory towards peers, colleagues, or students. So what happens if we identify ableism in action? How can we stop that? Well, most ableism tends to be out of ignorance and not out of hatred. Disciplinary actions should be as severe unless the offender's actions are repeated or outright spiteful, right? So like many people are approaching this out of ignorance, right? And we need to not only make sure that we are providing support and professional development for people so that we can move beyond that ignorance to have a fuller understanding of disability, but also we need to recognize that, right? We, as a community, don't provide a lot of professional development. And so we need to work to balance those two sides. We can also have our reaction to discriminatory behavior be based on the school's disciplinary protocol for ableism or discrimination. So if your institution has a reporting mechanism, or maybe you have an ombudsperson office, you can utilize those in order to further elevate the complaint. And can potentially standardized procedures could be helpful. So these design team members experienced ableism in action in their own lives. And they found that if we had a standardized procedure, they would be able to know what to do and know that there's a mechanism where they can redress the harm that's been done. And then finally, we can do an accountability buddy. Accountability buddies are where someone is paired with another person and help keep them accountable to any acts of ableism or ignorance. I have a couple of accountability buddies outside of disability spaces so that I can learn and be better moving forward. And I find that accountability buddies are super helpful because they can help catch those in the moment things that are grained into you. So consider having an accountability buddy. So those are some of the findings from the C2C design team. As I mentioned, we are going to be publishing a TPT paper soon with these findings, so keep an eye out for that in the next few months. Let me double check the chat real quick to see if there were questions. Okay, so I see Joe asked, can accommodations be built into the course? Yes, they can. And if we build accommodations into the course, those are then called inclusive teaching strategies. So for example, I provide like 12 hours for students to take exams so that I don't provide additional time for all students. Everybody can utilize that extra time to take the test. Okay, cool. Great. With that, I'm very happy to turn it over to our third speaker today. Take it away, Jackie.
Thanks, Erin. So I think building on what Erin had said previously, we're going to touch on some of the same concepts, and we are looking at things mentors are saying they are thinking about when they are working with students with disabilities in a physics setting. So on the next slide, oh, it's motivation before my project team. That was silly. Do you want to go to the next one? Thank you. So the research team, I want to acknowledge a lot of the slides and analysis I am going to show today are work by Dr. Constance Doty, who is currently a lecturer at the University of Central Florida. She was working as a postdoc with me on this project until this fall term. You may notice Erin Scanlon in a different stage, who was also a postdoc on this project. I don't know if that makes Liam my grand postdoc. I don't know. We are all in one academic tree, that is for sure. So Erin has continued to work with us on analysis of these interviews, and Constance and I did the interviews, and Dan Olenek is also a member of this research team, and they have done related interviews with students, but today I want to focus on what did physics mentors, and most of those were faculty who participated in interviews discuss. We were talking with them about students with disability in the physics community on a couple topics. So I think we need to go backwards or into the motivation really fast. So this research is part of a large project that is looking to identify ways that models of disability support or cause barriers for physics students and early career physicists. And Erin had mentioned two models early on in the presentation, the social and medical or individual model, but there are a range of different models folks use to describe different aspects of disability. Two models that I have highlighted here are the affirmative model and the tragedy model. These came into play when Liam's participants were talking about how not everything about being autistic is bad in general or is bad in a physics setting even, right? So affirmative model acknowledges that there are benefits as well as disadvantages of impairment on individuals and their well-being, whereas a tragedy model puts all things in a negative light in terms of disability. So in the next few minutes, I want to talk with you about investigating physics mentors' conceptions about their physics mentees on two specific topics. First being taking up that affirmative model. What are positive conceptions that physics mentors share about their mentees' disability? And then secondly, kind of connecting with Erin's. I didn't do this on purpose, but it worked so nice. Looking at what are physics mentors' conceptions of the impact of disability on physics, on mentees' physics career opportunities. So just a little bit about the data I will be presenting today. We recruited participants by emailing folks who had earlier participated in a survey. So we had sent a survey out through attending conferences as well as through some listservs. I think this listserv was one of them. So thank you anybody who responded to that survey. And we asked at the end whether folks would be willing to participate in an interview. And we have conducted interviews over 3 semesters, spring 22, fall 22, and fall 23. Participants could either participate in a 1 hour, 2 1 hour, or 1 2 hour interview. And we've had 14 physics faculty participate in these interviews. They have all been conducted via Zoom. They were guided by a semi-structured interview protocol. So we had questions we wanted to talk to you, but we also followed up on things participants mentioned. And our participants all identified as either Asian or white, and all identified as either a woman or a man, and they were faculty in both research and teaching intensive positions. So we, Constance and I have been engaged in analyzing these interviews through different themes. And so that when I present our more put together analysis, that is all things where both Constance and I have independently coded these mentor interviews to identify excerpts. And we've done this for all of them, for both the positive codes, the career codes, and then a separate code I'm not going to talk about today, disability talk. We go through these whole interviews, we look through chunks of transcripts where participants are talking about these general themes, and then we try to, within those broad concepts, broad topics, look for more specific areas of interest. And so all of this was coded under positive until both researchers agreed, and both researchers have also agreed on all transcript segments that we attribute to the career code. So I'm going to break this talk into 2 chunks, first talking about themes under the positive code, and then talking about themes under their career code. So this first chunk is positive conceptions of impairment espoused by physics mentors who work with disabled students. If you were at the summer meeting of AEPT this year and you saw Constance's talk, these are slides from Constance's summer AEPT presentation. So for this one, we are further along in our analysis, and so I can tell you how many of the mentors we identified as discussing each or of having a positive quote. And so one thing I want to point out is that this model, when we analyze our interviews in terms of disability models, the positive model is identified least frequently among mentors' speech. So we coded for the 14 mentors, we found that 9 of the 14 mentors made comments that we aligned with the positive model of disability. And out of those 9 mentors, we identified 15 excerpts from the interviews where the mentor was aligning their speech with what we felt was a positive model of disability. We also, so that's one finding, right, is that this is not a model that mentors used frequently when talking about their students. Of those coded excerpts, we noticed that the majority of participants espoused a positive conception for mentees when they were talking about mentees with a non-apparent impairment. So Liam had mentioned that students with autism, that's something that they decide often to come out with. Sometimes people may notice that person has characteristics that they attribute to autism, but other times we don't notice those things, or a certain person may not notice those things. So things like autism, ADHD, anxiety, as well as chronic health conditions may be non-apparent compared to other things like visual or hearing impairments, where often there are signals that a person may have those impairments. So we see that these often came up, positive aspects of disability often came up, particularly for people with autism, but then also to some extent for these other impairments as well. So I'm going to go through some exemplar quotes from our mentor interviews that we had coded as aligned with the positive model of disability. The slides will all have this kind of form where there's just a person to remind us that these are people making these comments. The quote will be in the blue box. And then the person's pseudonym will be provided, as well as their race, ethnicity, and gender, and the type of faculty position that they had. When the quote is about a specific mentee, we will also share what is the impairment of the mentee that they were talking about. So our first theme is that some participants recognize that different pathways of understanding can be beneficial to the physics communities. I think this echoes back to one of the strengths Liam's participants shared about being autistic in a physics community. So William, who's a white male and a research-intensive physician, when discussing their mentees with non-apparent disabilities, said the only benefit that occurs to me is that mindset that gives them somehow a different perspective or a different way of looking at the world around them that can be helpful in physics, because part of physics is built on creative insights. So people who see the world in a different way than I do may also have different insights that turn out to be useful. Another example was shared by Charlie, who is an Asian man and a research-intensive physician, about their mentee with ADHD. They said those students who have the nature of their neural system impairs their function in a lot of cases, but the same structure, the same feature could be beneficial and make them highly productive or highly creative in other situations. So even though these are worded and maybe not the way we hope they will be in 20 years, we do see that these mentors are picking up that having a different way of thinking may cause us to have a messy backpack, but it also may cause us to be someone who solves problems in a useful way. The next theme is that some participants recognized that their neurodivergent mentees have attuned coding skills. So this was a very specific one. So here, Wendy, who's a white woman in a teaching intensive position, was talking about a mentee with ADHD and anxiety. And Wendy said she had this novel way of doing problems and her programming. She did the program in a way that was totally at odds with how everyone else had already programmed that thing, but it was so very, very different. And it worked a lot better, especially as a way to complement the existing code. She found these small errors that were really hard to notice. And then when you did it from her way, you just naturally wouldn't make those errors and you would notice the difference between the two. So bringing that novel approach to problem solving into a very specific area of physics with using coding skills. And I think another mentor had a related quote. So this is Robin, who's a white woman in a research-intensive position, talking about an autistic mentee. She said, the project that we have her working on is extremely detailed. She's basically building up a code base. And I've never seen somebody learn a coding language as fast as she did. She went from never touching it to better than I am in 6 weeks. So I think what's important from this is to realize people may have specific skills that are relevant in many areas of physics. And so it's important that just because somebody isn't really maybe clicking with a particular area, that they may excel in a different area. And I think our final theme on this code is making sure that we critique that accommodation should not be considered advantageous. So this was a tricky one for us to think about how we wanted to code it, and this is how we've decided to share it in presentations, is that there was a tension in some participants' responses to one of the questions where we specifically asked, are there any benefits that the student you're thinking about experienced given their disability or impairment in this situation? And Ben, who was an Asian man in a research-intensive position, was talking about a mentee with visual impairments. And they said, yeah, I guess maybe the only benefit would be that they can pay 100% attention to, for example, for the visually impaired student, she can pay 100% attention to what I was saying because she doesn't have to take notes. Her interpreter was taking the notes. Now, I don't know whether that's really an advantage or not. And so we want to make sure that we are not attributing advantage to accommodations because accommodations are leveling the playing field. They're not giving a student a one-up on other students in the class. Similarly, we had William, who's a white male in a research-intensive position, when they were talking about their mentee with a mobility impairment. They said, I don't recall any benefits. It seems like it's not really fair, for instance, to call an extra 30 minutes on the test a benefit. It's just compensating for the fact that he wrote slower than other people. So this is more the mindset that we're hoping physics faculty will be developing about accommodations. Switching gears to look at emerging themes from our mentor interviews that we had quoted as career. So these are more in progress. Constance and I had just started developing some subcategories under career when she was suddenly teaching a whole bunch of classes and running a whole bunch of GTAs. So we haven't gotten to discuss these as fully as the prior codes. I will present them in a similar format. The text boxes are a different color just to help us remember that we switched topics. The first theme, oops, I did really bad on my animations. The first theme that I wanted to share was the variable impact of disability across physics career type and by disability type as perceived by our mentors. So Ben, who was an Asian male in a research intensive position, said physics is a demanding field. So sometimes, especially for experimental work or lab work, disability can really be an impediment. No matter how much we try to help them still, I think it won't be the same for those without disabilities. For theoretical work, I don't think it's that much of a challenge in most cases. So this was a common theme across mentors that people with disabilities would not necessarily be a good fit in experimental research, but they would be much more able to do theoretical research. Here we have Matthew, who's, I think this should say white man. Sorry, he's a white man in a research intensive position that said, in the research lab, we generally communicate by speaking out loud. So a person who's very thoroughly deaf, you would have to find a different way to communicate. I don't think that means they couldn't do it, but I think that perhaps he would call that a difficulty, but I don't think it would mean that they should not consider doing the work. So again, I think we hear them calling out specifically the research lab. That's not the only place that we are talking in groups as scientists. So I think that was an interesting studying that Matthew thought about this challenge within. But we do see that Matthew has this mentality that doesn't, just because there's going to be a challenge of this one aspect in this one setting doesn't mean that we shouldn't be encouraging students to go into that setting, but that is a place where we're going to have to problem solve. So on this slide, I wanted to share some of the quotes, and this first one is enormous, that come up about the interaction of accommodations and the workplace. And so this participant is Will. He's a white male in a teaching intensive position, and he's talking about a mentee with anxiety. And so he says, I had one student where I could see that it's going to be a huge issue. So we're asking, like, what is the impact of accommodations on a person's future career? He says, I have this one case where I have a student where it's going to be a huge issue. He had anxiety to the point that he got a form from the Office of Disability Resources saying that he gets extra time because of extreme anxiousness. Okay, so I asked him then, I said, well, you know, what is it you want to do? He wants to be an ER physician. And I'm sitting here thinking, wait a minute, you have extreme anxiety under stress and you want to be an ER physician? Maybe someone needs to have a conversation with you. He's like, oh no, I've already looked into it. You know, the medical schools still accommodate that. I'm just going, wait a minute, I don't want you as my ER physician that, okay, give me 10 minutes, maybe spouting blood, I need 10 minutes here. So I've had a few cases where I just kind of did aside, like, are you sure this is really what you're going to do? Is this really going to work? You know, by and large, though, I don't really see it as the kind of things that students are going into in engineering. Yeah, okay, you need a little extra time. That's not a big deal. But if you're in a high stress kind of position, having an anxiety disorder could probably be a problem. So I want us to notice here is that William is probably way outside William's lane with this student, right? So William is a student's physics teacher. They are not this person's medical career advisor. William is maybe not considering that the person may have anxiety during tests. That is very different than the way their body and mind function in a medical stressful scenario. There are some of us who, when that is the thing, everything runs a lot more smoothly because our brain is prioritizing resources to solve that kind of problem. But this is something that Will chose to share in the interview as a potential drawback. And it even sounds like they're having a conversation with the student about that drawback. So I want us to just take this as an example to make sure that we are not stepping outside of where we should be directing students based on our preconceptions about the role of accommodations in the workplace. And I think that comes into play a lot better in the second example of Robin, who's a white woman at a research intensive institution. When she was talking about her autistic mentee, she said, I think that I see the role of accommodations as helping students figure out how they work best. When I send my mentee off into the world of academia, if she's going into industry, she's going to know what she needs when she's looking for a job. So more thinking about, we are equipping students to figure out what they need to succeed, and that self-knowledge, the student is going to use that in the real world to figure out what the student wants to do. And that is more our job as instructors than trying to close down the students' opportunities, which I think leads really well into the final theme that I picked to share, which is that a couple of participants talked about students needing to find a job that fits their personal limitations. So William, who's a white male at a research intensive university, this is a different person than Will on the prior slide, said, I would see maybe discouraging somebody, maybe for instance, with mobility issues from pursuing a career where they envision themselves as being sort of in very much a hands-on role in a laboratory, as opposed to other roles in a laboratory, like monitoring equipment and making the decisions about when to throw a particular switch based on the readouts of the equipment. That's a role of somebody for who, instance, can't use their hands. That's a role that they could easily and productively take. This is kind of a mixed opinion. They're not saying this person can't be in that setting, right? They're talking about what are things the person could do within the setting. And what's interesting is that they go on to talk about, robots could do some of these things. And so I think it's interesting to think about being creative about how a person can perform the functions that need to be performed, even if that's in a different way. But it's still interesting to talk about discouraging somebody from going into that situation, which I think if we take it further down the lane is our final instructor quote from Anna. And Anna had a lot of real world experience with disability that I think showed up in how pragmatic she was in her responses. But I think it's also difficult that we don't want to keep our own experiences. We don't bring our own experiences into narrowing students' opportunities. And so Anna says, I think that it's nice to dream big, but you need to be realistic and see what you can do in a way that you can be successful. You need to evaluate your abilities. This sounds very stark, and it was very stark. But Anna did talk a lot about how that wasn't the role of higher education, that these are conversations that parents and counselors and things should be having with people. So a little more in her lane than some of our other quotes, but I think this is a complex area for our mentors. For a long time, we did not have folks with disabilities trying to come into the physics area. And then we see that reflected in the mentors complicated thoughts about how to support students. And so to summarize, we see that some physics mentors espouse benefits of their mentees' impairments on their being in physics, specifically for non-apparent impairments like anxiety, ADHD, and autism. And sometimes mentors can potentially stray beyond their expertise and experience in critiquing disabled students' career plans. That is the end of my slides. And so we talked more than we were supposed to. Sorry, folks. Thanks for bearing with us. And I think we wanted to open the floor to questions from y'all. If you don't have questions for us, we have questions for you. But I see one came in for Liam. It says they basically can't learn the math of physics unless they already see a picture of what's going on in my head. Is that a thing?
It is the sheer amount of people who I interviewed who are just like, I need the picture, I need it in front of me. Exactly. Yes. People's brains are weird. They do cool things, and that's absolutely a thing. And thank you for sharing that. That's awesome. 'Cause my I only work in words, so I can't really visualize that well. And so like quantum was great, but like classical mechanics was awful, because it's all pictures.
I have a question. I guess, do you have any, I guess, experiences with regards to, like, I guess, at least well, I think from from what I've always done, and what I've seen my colleagues do, like we kind of put a premium on like collaboration and small group work, um, and how like we can, because I think when I learned about, like, doing group work, I don't think there was much thought to the sort of the different abilities of the students and what kind of environment that we were putting students into, and now I think when you think about forming groups and thinking about groups and how those group dynamics work, I feel like I need to be better attuned to um making sure it's like an equitable environment for students with disabilities. So is there like advice in terms of like thinking about like how you might like manage group dynamics and put students in a good place to succeed when they're working in small groups?
Was that for me? I'm sorry.
Well,
I'm happy to.
actually, I don't know if it wasn't really. I guess it was just for anyone who might have
Okay.
some
Yeah,
experiences
yeah,
to share.
yeah. So I think there's a couple of things I would suggest. So number one, so we didn't talk a lot about universal design for learning except at the end of Liam's talk, but that's a really useful framework. In UDL, they have some suggestions about how to foster collaboration and community by doing things like creating group norms or group contracts where students come together and talk about how they are going to be collaborating as a group and what are their expectations of each other to prepare for and engage with the group. You can also do things like have group roles, which can help support students to know what they're actually supposed to be doing in class and what are the do's and don'ts of what they're doing. So that comes from UDL. And then in terms of group formation, so there's a lot of different strategies, right? You can group by major, you can group by interest, you can group by FCI score, which is the forced concept inventory, or you can, sort by alphabet. From my experience, I don't know that I have a lot of suggestions on which one is better. The thing I would mention though is that sometimes it's a little bit easier for students to work alone if working in a group is going to cause significant challenges for them. So usually I will get a accommodation request from my local Office of Disability Services to provide that accommodation if necessary. But I think it's just considering what are your goals for it? What do you want students to be able to get out of it? And then making sure you're providing multiple options and supports for students to engage in whatever you want them to be engaging in. Jackie or Liam, did you have something to add?
I think that I would just add that sometimes being flexible about how we form the groups can be helpful. I've had students that are anxious who would ask to work with a certain student, and I know sometimes we don't want to allow that. We feel like the student's asking for preferential treatment, and like Erin said, sometimes then as the instructor, we might want to think about, where are my goals? Like I do, of course, want students to learn to work with a variety of people, but my primary goal is that the student is learning physics problem solving skills. And so if doing the assignment alone or doing the assignment with a chosen group meet is going to support that student in my primary goal, then maybe I let my secondary goal go for now. And that is very different and very in different settings. So I said I just am here at Ohio State University in my first semester, and the way they run their courses is completely different than how I ran the courses were run in my prior university. I don't actually have almost any of those decisions that I can make at the moment. And so what I am trying to do, yeah, it's wild, is empathize with students about things that are hard. Because what I can do is agree with them that maybe they're experiencing some ableist practices and work behind the scenes to try to get those changed in the long run. But I have noticed the students perk up a little bit when I agree with them that what they're experiencing is not what I feel like they should be experiencing.
I have another question. So to what extent can we kind of push students who may come to us, for instance, in private conversation, and we can kind of, or they may say it, or we may recognize that they're maybe neurodivergent and they could benefit from the accommodations that the college offers, but they don't want to register with the office, and that creates a bit of a challenge there. And I'm not sure to what extent I can be pushy in that direction or just hold back and just let them be. I'm not sure. That's always a tricky dilemma for me.
I can respond to that and then let others, that was definitely a topic that we touched on with a couple of the interviewees in my study, and that's what's going to eventually partially go into that theme I didn't talk about. One thing that I will say is that we heard from some students who a professor was the first one to suggest that they might look into getting assessment for something like ADHD. And those students were often pretty grateful that the instructor had done that. I don't think that's all cases, but I think in all of the cases where the students reported to us that they had a positive association, what the professor said was something like, the way you are, how much knowledge I see you have about this topic when I talk with you is not matching up with what I see on your exams or your homeworks or these other things. And so I don't think you're struggling with the content. I think you're struggling with something different. Have you ever considered such and such? And so like coming to the student as knowledgeable about your subject and yourself as not necessarily knowledgeable about what these other things might be, but as that being a potential reason why they're having the struggles they're having. Some students have responded positively to that. I would also say that making it very transparent that you want to support the students' accommodations, that you know accommodations level the playing field, and that you want students to ask for them, makes students much more likely to come talk to you about what potential accommodations they have or what they might need. And then I think like, yeah, and then if we can do more, as we can do more universally designed practices, then we're bringing those opportunities to everybody, regardless of if they have a specific accommodation for them. Erin or Leah?
Could you repeat the question? I was also answering a second question. I'm so sorry. I know it's in my wheelhouse.
I think that question was
Sorry.
how far do we push students, right? If we feel like they might benefit from having an accommodation, but they haven't reached out to one yet, Where's that boundary? What's the role of an instructor in kind of having those conversations? Is that a good overview, Kareem?
Yeah,
You put
yes,
it better
love
than
that.
I did. Thank you.
So definitely this is like coming from a neurodivergent instructor myself, right? Is I find there's a lot of power in my being loudly and aggressively neurodivergent, you know, of being like, hey, I benefit from these things. Like like even in like classes where I don't have very much like leeway to change curricula or change or provide like individualized assessment or individualized accommodations, uh, I still am able to be like just kind of loudly at the class, like, hey, I happen to enjoy when like XYZ is accommodated in, and this sounds so passive aggressive the way I'm saying it, but just being like, hey, like when I was in school, I did these things and they really helped me. Not even phrasing it as a go get a not don't phrase it as just like you're autistic, go away. But like phrase it as like this helps me, your instructor, this will help you, your student, you know. And of course, like tailoring it individually is super important, and I don't necessarily have many hints for that, but
Thank you.
So I'm going to jump in here because we are at the end of our time. I think Erin wanted to share a couple of things.
Yes. Okay. So the design team, we are always looking for more folks, as well as the C2C project is hiring a postdoc. So if you know anyone who's looking for a postdoc position doing disability identity work, let me know. I'll put my email in the chat.
Thank you. And just very briefly, if you can take like a minute to complete the feedback form, it really helps us, and we'll share feedback with the facilitators as well. We want to make sure that Optics is providing high quality programming that serves your needs. And this helps us keep funding from NSF. So with that, thank you so much to Liam and Erin and Jackie for sharing your time and expertise with us. I will put the link to the evaluation in the chat as well.